Nobody paid attention to the homeless man sitting alone in the corner booth until he rolled up his sleeve to check the time on a cracked watch, revealing a tattoo so rare, so sacred, that only 300 men in the entire world were authorized to wear it. A SEAL Team 6 trident surrounded by classified mission dates that made Colonel David Mitchell, who was ordering his morning coffee, freeze mid-sentence and whisper, "Dear God, that's not possible." The man's name was Marcus Stone, though nobody at Riverside Coffee had bothered to ask. To them, he was just another drifter who shuffled in with the morning crowd, his torn military jacket hanging loose over a frame that had once been powerful, but now seemed diminished by months of sleeping rough and surviving on whatever charity he could find. His boots were cracked leather held together with duct tape, his beard was unkempt and streaked with premature gray, and his eyes carried the hollow look of someone who had seen too much and lost everything that mattered. For 3 weeks, Marcus had been coming to this same coffee shop, not because he could afford their prices, but because it was warm, relatively safe, and the manager hadn't yet worked up the courage to kick him out permanently. He would sit in the furthest corner, making a single cup of black coffee last for hours, while he stared out the window at a world that seemed to move around him without acknowledgement, like he was a ghost haunting the edges of normal life. The other customers avoided him with the practiced indifference that urban dwellers perfect when faced with homelessness. Quick glances, followed by deliberate blindness, conversations that lowered in volume when he was nearby, and the subtle shifting of purses and bags to the far side of chairs. The barista served him with minimal eye contact and barely concealed impatience, their smiles reserved for customers who looked like they belonged in a place that charged $7 for specialty drinks. But that Tuesday morning was different, though Marcus didn't know it yet. As he sat nursing his coffee and absently rubbing his left forearm where an old injury still ached in the cold, he noticed his watch had stopped again, a cheap digital piece he'd picked up at a pawn shop after losing everything else. Without thinking, he pushed up his sleeve of his jacket to check the time on the cracked face, exposing for just a moment the intricate tattoo that covered most of his upper arm.
It wasn't the kind of tattoo you got at a mall parlor or picked from a wall of designs. This was art, carved into flesh with the precision of military engineering. A Navy SEAL trident with wings spread wide, surrounded by a circle of dates written in Roman numerals, each one representing a classified mission that had taken him into the darkest corners of the world. Below the trident, in letters so small they were barely readable, were the words Neptune's Spear, the code name for the operation that had made him a legend in circles where legends were never spoken aloud. Colonel David Mitchell had been reaching for his wallet when his peripheral vision caught the movement of Marcus rolling up his sleeve. At first, it was just a casual glance, the kind of automatic awareness that 25 years of military service had embedded in his DNA. But when his eyes focused on the tattoo, his hand froze halfway to his pocket, his breath caught in his throat, and the rest of the coffee shop seemed to fade into background noise. Mitchell knew that tattoo, not the design. Plenty of SEALs had tridents inked on their arms, but the specific dates, the precise artwork, the sacred symbols that only a select few were ever authorized to wear. He had seen it before, years ago in a classified briefing about an operation so secret that even mentioning its existence required security clearance that most generals would never possess. Neptune's Spear, he whispered under his breath, the words barely audible over the hum of the espresso machine. Marcus looked up at the sound, his eyes meeting the colonel's for the first time in weeks that anyone had looked directly at him. There was recognition there, but not the kind Marcus usually saw, not the fearful assessment of threat level or the pitying glance of someone calculating how much spare change they might offer. This was something else entirely. Respect, awe, and a growing understanding that was spreading across the older man's face like dawn breaking over a battlefield.
Mitchell approached slowly, his mind racing through classified files and buried reports,
trying to reconcile the man sitting before him with the legend he had heard whispered in Pentagon corridors. The official story was that Marcus Stone had died in Afghanistan 3 years ago, killed in action during a rescue operation that had saved dozens of American lives. His funeral had been closed casket, his medals awarded posthumously, his family told that his body had been too damaged by the explosion to recover. But here he was, alive and forgotten, invisible to a world that had already mourned him. "Excuse me," Mitchell said quietly, sliding into the booth across from Marcus without invitation. "That tattoo, where did you get it?" Marcus instinctively pulled his sleeve back down, a reflex born from months of trying to blend into the background. "Just a tattoo, sir, nothing special." But Mitchell had seen enough. The dates matched, the artwork was exact, and now, looking closer at the man's face, beneath the beard and the weight loss and the premature aging that comes from trauma, he could see the bone structure that matched a photograph he had studied in classified briefings, the same eyes that had stared back at him from a commendation report he had read years ago. "You're Marcus Stone," Mitchell said, not as a question, but as a statement of impossible fact. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He hadn't heard his real name spoken aloud in months. To the shelters, he was just another John Doe. To the social workers, he was a case number. To the world, he was invisible. But this man, this colonel whose bearing and ribbons marked him as someone who had climbed the highest ranks of military leadership, knew exactly who he was. "I don't know what you're talking about," Marcus replied, but his voice cracked with the effort of maintaining a lie that had become his only protection. Mitchell reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone, scrolling quickly through contacts until he found what he was looking for. He turned the screen toward Marcus, showing him a photograph that had been taken 5 years earlier. A young Navy SEAL in full dress uniform, standing at attention as the President of the United States pinned the Navy Cross to his chest. "This is you," Mitchell said, simply. "Operation Neptune Spear, Afghanistan, 2019. You and your team rescued 43 civilians from a terrorist stronghold, held off enemy forces for 18 hours while extraction was coordinated, and carried 6 wounded teammates to safety across 12 miles of hostile territory. The official report says you died when an IED destroyed the compound after everyone else was evacuated."
Marcus stared at the photograph, his hands trembling slightly as memories he had spent months trying to bury came flooding back. The weight of his gear, the sound of gunfire echoing off stone walls, the faces of the hostages they had been sent to save. The moment when everything went wrong and he made the choice that would haunt him forever. "That man died in Afghanistan," Marcus said quietly. "What's left isn't worth saving." The coffee shop around them had grown quiet, other customers sensing that something significant was happening in the corner booth, but not understanding what. The barista who had served Marcus with barely concealed disgust was now watching with curiosity, her perception beginning to shift as she observed the intense conversation between the homeless man and the obviously important military officer. Mitchell leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that only Marcus could hear. "Son, I've read your file. All of it, including the parts that are still classified. You didn't just save those hostages, you saved my nephew. Lieutenant James Mitchell was part of the extraction team that got pinned down in that compound. He's alive today because of what you did." The revelation hit Marcus like a sledgehammer. He remembered Lieutenant Mitchell, young, brave, bleeding from a leg wound that should have killed him if Marcus hadn't carried him to the evacuation point. He remembered the kid's last words as they loaded him onto the helicopter. "Tell my family, I tried to make them proud."
Jimmy? Marcus whispered, the name emerging from deep memory. He made it?
He made it, Mitchell confirmed. He's a captain now, stationed in Germany. Married, 2 kids. He talks about you sometimes. About the ghost who carried him out of hell. We thought you were dead. Tears began forming in Marcus's eyes, the first real emotion he had allowed himself to feel in months. For so long he had convinced himself that the mission had been a failure, that the explosion had been his fault, that the men who died had been his responsibility. The survivor's guilt had eaten away at him until he could no longer face his family, his unit, or himself. The others didn't make it, Marcus said, his voice barely audible. Rodriguez, Chen, Williams, they were still in the compound when it went up. I should have stayed. I should have. You should have done exactly what you did. You followed orders, completed the mission, and saved every life that could be saved. Rodriguez, Chen, and Williams knew the risks when they volunteered to stay behind and set the charges. They died heroes, just like you were supposed to. The colonel reached across the table and placed his hand on Marcus's shoulder, a gesture that conveyed more than words ever could. What happened to you after the explosion? Why did command report you as KIA?
Marcus wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, struggling to find words for a story he had never told anyone. I was thrown clear by the blast, but the concussion scrambled my brain pretty good. Local villagers found me 3 days later, half dead and with no memory of who I was. By the time I recovered enough to remember my name, my unit had already been told I was dead. I tried to make contact, but he trailed off, unable to explain the crushing weight of guilt that had made him want to stay dead, the psychological wounds that had convinced him he didn't deserve to come home when his brothers hadn't. Mitchell nodded, understanding more than Marcus knew. He had seen it before. Good soldiers broken not by enemy bullets, but by the impossible burden of survival. Men who came home in body, but left their souls on foreign battlefields. "Son," he said gently, "it's time to come home." The next hour passed in a blur of phone calls and quiet conversations. Mitchell made contact with his superiors, explaining the situation in careful, measured terms. Marcus provided what identification he could remember, answered questions about classified operations that only he would know, and slowly began to accept that his self-imposed exile was over. The barista, who had served him with such disdain, now stood at a respectful distance, her attitude completely transformed as she overheard fragments of the conversation. Other customers had begun to take notice as well, sensing that the homeless man they had ignored was someone far more significant than his appearance suggested. As the morning progressed, the small coffee shop became an impromptu command center. Military personnel began arriving in civilian clothes, intelligence officers who needed to verify Marcus's identity, medical personnel who wanted to assess his condition, and finally a VA representative who began the process of restoring his official status and benefits. But the most important arrival came near noon, when a young man in civilian clothes entered the coffee shop and looked around uncertainly. He was tall, confident, with the bearing of a military officer, even out of uniform. When his eyes found Marcus sitting in the corner booth, his face went pale with shock and recognition. "Sir?" Lieutenant, now Captain, James Mitchell said tentatively, approaching the table where his uncle and Marcus were still talking. "Is it really you?" Marcus looked up at the young man he had carried to safety 3 years ago, seeing how he had grown and matured, seeing the life that had been saved by those 18 hours of hell in Afghanistan. Without a word, he stood and pulled the captain into an embrace that conveyed years of worry, guilt, and relief.
"I thought you were gone," James whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We all thought you were gone." "I was, but I think I'm ready to come back now." The transformation that occurred in that coffee shop over the next few hours became the stuff of local legend. Word spread quickly through social media and local news outlets about the homeless veteran who had been revealed as a decorated war hero, about the chance encounter that had restored a dead man to life, about the colonel who had recognized a sacred tattoo and refused to walk away. The barista who had treated Marcus with such indifference publicly apologized, offering him free coffee for life and asking if she could do anything to help with his transition back to normal life. Other customers who had ignored him for weeks now approached with handshakes and gratitude, ashamed of their previous blindness, but eager to make amends. The coffee shop owner, upon learning the full story, immediately offered Marcus a job and a place to stay while he got back on his feet. Local veterans organizations rallied around him, providing support, counseling, and the kind of brotherhood that he had thought was lost forever.
But perhaps the most significant moment came at the end of that extraordinary day, when Marcus finally called his sister in Ohio, the first contact he had made with his family since disappearing into the streets months earlier. The conversation was brief, punctuated by tears and stammered apologies, but it marked the beginning of a journey back to the life he had thought was over. As the sun set over Seattle that evening, Marcus Stone sat in a clean hotel room provided by the VA, staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. The homeless man who had entered the coffee shop that morning was still there, but something fundamental had changed. The hollow look in his eyes had been replaced by something that might eventually become hope. The tattoo on his arm, the sacred symbol that had saved him, remained hidden beneath his sleeve, but it no longer felt like a burden. It was what it had always been, a mark of honor, a reminder of service and connection to brothers who would never be forgotten. 3 months later, Captain Marcus Stone, retired, stood before a congressional committee testifying about the gaps in veteran services that had allowed a decorated war hero to fall through the cracks and disappear into homelessness. His story became a catalyst for reform, leading to improved tracking systems for at-risk veterans and better coordination between military and civilian support services. The coffee shop where it all began now displays a small plaque near the corner booth where Marcus used to sit, reading simply, "Not all heroes wear uniforms. Some wear the invisible wounds of service. Look closer. Listen harder. Honor always." And every Tuesday morning, Marcus returns to that same coffee shop, not as a homeless man seeking shelter, but as a reminder that sometimes salvation comes in the form of recognition, someone who sees past the surface and acknowledges the sacred symbols that mark a life dedicated to something greater than oneself. The tattoo on his arm remains hidden most of the time, visible only when he reaches for his wallet or adjusts his watch. But for those who know what to look for, it tells a story that deserves to be seen, honored, and never forgotten. Because in the end, the most powerful thing about that tattoo wasn't its rarity or its symbolism. It was the fact that it connected one forgotten soul to another, bridging the gap between the man he had been and the man he was capable of being again. And sometimes that's all it takes to save a life. Someone who recognizes the sacred in the overlooked, the heroic in the homeless, and the truth hidden beneath the surface of what we think we see.